What smoking all my dragons, divine righteous almighty greats overachieving, never slacking. And this is a Thomas Sowell video. This is Thomas Sowell, the origin of the left's war on white people in America. And we're going to check this out and see what this is about. Let's do it. Original link in the description. Here we go.
These issues are very real. There's more issues here. Racism is a very serious problem in the United States. Take a look at the scholarly work on it, say George Fredrickson's study of white supremacy, comparative study. He concludes, I think, plausibly that the white supremacy in the United States was even more extreme and savage than in South Africa. Just think of our own history.
My concern is doing away with whiteness. Whiteness is a form of racial oppression, sure. The suggestion is that it is somehow possible to separate whiteness from oppression, and it is not. There can be no white race without the phenomenon of white supremacy. If you abolish slavery, you abolish slaveholders. In the same way, if you abolish racial oppression, you do away with whiteness. Treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity.
Your views are fairly well received in academia.
Yes, they're legitimate, not to say that everyone agrees, but sure. I could not point to any examples where it has provoked political censorship. Whiteness is an identity that arises entirely out of oppression. Whiteness is not a culture, it's not a religion, it's not a language, it's simply an oppressive social category.
I actually agree with that. You know, that just social classes, white and black, period. And you know, it throws groups of different people in different pots. And when they're thrown in that pots, it's easy to create these narratives. And that just keeps people at each other's necks and thinking, you know, the world is a certain way that it may not be.
Learn from history. The minority has never been able to control the majority. White Americans will soon be a minority, and that's great.
Intellectuals and race. If minorities were seen as the problem during the progressive era, the majority was seen as the problem during the liberal era that began after the Second World War. The central premise of liberal intellectuals for decades was that the racial problem was essentially inside the minds of white people. Explain that, Tom.
Well, what Gunnar Myrdal, who did the classic study on this, said was that you didn't even have to look at what blacks did. You could only look at what the whites were thinking, and this suggests that that these random thoughts from nowhere were the reason for the problems. The problem was that different groups of people have been different in substance all around the world and for centuries, and that blacks and whites in the United States are no exception to that. And it's very hard to have a society where people with very different cultures coexist.
Tom, you quote in Intellectuals and Race the famous black writer James Baldwin. He's writing in 1960, quote, "People in Harlem know they are living there because white people do not think they are good enough to live anywhere else. In a new housing project in Harlem, they naturally began smashing windows, defacing walls, and, you'll forgive me, but this is his language, urinating in the elevators." Close quote. What's wrong with his thinking?
Oh my gosh, you'd need a couple of hours. But it so happens I grew up in Harlem in the 1940s, 1950s, and you didn't expect to find.
So this is a man who grew up in Harlem, so he has every right to his opinion about Harlem. So
Find people urinating in places where black people lived. In fact, there's very little attention given to the fact that the public housing of that era was radically different from the public housing of today. I remember we had a relative of ours got into some public housing. We were so proud because you had to have a certain character, a record, and so forth to get in. These were not places where you had dumping grounds for people who were at the bottom of the pile.
There was no less discrimination in the 40s and 50s in the minds of white people toward black people when you were growing up in Harlem.
That's right.
And yet Harlem, I was just thinking about this the other day, that great Duke Ellington classic, Take the A Train.
Yeah.
The A Train was and remains, as far as I know, the subway train up the west side of Manhattan.
Yes.
It's what white people used to get to Harlem. Harlem
Yeah.
was an attractive place. It was a place of culture and excitement. So What was it then, if it wasn't in the minds of white people, what took place in Harlem in the 60s?
I think the 60s was a period of general irrationality, and wherever there's irrationality, there are people who know how to turn that irrationality to their benefit. And you began to get some very opportunistic leaders who then began to say things that they knew to be false, but which they knew would advance their careers.
Now, let me quote Intellectuals and Race one more time. Among the
So, long story short, if I could simplify it, if I could just tell, pretty much what he's saying is people were pretty much going with certain narratives and adding fuel to the fire to help a certain agenda. That's what I'm picking up. Y'all can let me know if I'm wrong.
the differences between the two eras, that is to say, the time you grew up in Harlem and the 60s, was that the intelligentsia, both black and white, became more prone in the later period to make excuses for moral squalor and barbaric behavior. Your words here. After such notions permeated the society, barbaric behavior and moral squalor became accepted norms within some segments, close quote. So you are not merely making the argument, I'm asking, that the liberal view that what was in their minds dictated the behavior of African Americans. That you're not merely making the view that liberals were mistaken. You're making the view that you're making the argument that they were culpable.
Yes. And as I point out in a few places in the book, you can go to England and see the very same pattern emerging, including this pattern where kids in school who are trying to do well get beaten up by other kids. Theodore Dalrymple is a doctor in Britain, and he writes about the kids who have to go to the hospital. They're so badly beaten up simply because they're doing well in school, and these are white kids, lower class in Britain. So you see the very same pattern, and all the things that are supposed to explain that pattern and explain it away among blacks are found among people who have none of those same factors. But what's the same in both places is that the intellectuals have told them that the world is unjust, that other people are keeping them down, that the fact that they don't have what other people have is somebody else's fault. And if you buy that vision, then of course there's no reason for you to do well in school, and you resent those who do well because they've bought into the enemy's way of thinking.
Man, oh man, I definitely get my allergies. Whew, I cannot wait till these allergies are over. But I definitely hear what he's saying, and it's like it definitely feels like there's an agenda that has been pushed. Now, obviously, we know a history, we know what's happened, and at the end of the day, though, it's so rough because I feel like we live on lands now where it's so much selling out. It's been so much selling out. Like, so much people have sold the people out that it's hard to tell who's who. And so much narratives and so much distractions that kind of keep the people at each other's, they do keep the people at each other's necks, that I feel like if I was to speak on my generation today, the only way for us to break out of it is to be judged individual based off character and work together in unison. Because it's just so much from the past. There is so much mixy stuff, I feel like there's a war on everyone. I feel like it's like, okay, place the victim mindset on the so-called blacks. Place, on so-called, regular white people, so-called white people, place that, I guess in a sense, that white supremacy tag on them, that slave master tag on them, and keep them at each other. I was walking through actually a trailer park, and I remember saying to somebody I was with, I'm like, man, this feels like the forgotten America in a sense. So many people that don't have money, that are in that what would be poor, so much unheard voices here. You know, you hear about, people in what we call the ghettos, the so-called ghettos, and the hood, and you hear about their stories, but then there's so much other people in America you don't hear about. And I've traveled a lot and I see it. So much other stories you don't hear about. It's people living underground in tunnels in New York City, and all complexions. Um, at the end of the day, we do know certain people are targeted, and were targeted, and continue to be targeted. But I just feel like it's all in different ways now. I feel like everybody's targeted, but in different ways now. Through narratives and through just so much. Like I said, the separation of black and white. I mean, look at what the Irish. Look at when they came here. How they had to fight to fit in. Look at how what Italians. They were not considered white. They were getting hung. They were in so-called black neighborhoods. Integrating with blacks, so-called blacks, until they was able to pass as white. So it's just like it's so much, so much division, so much confusion. And a lot of people do believe in these stupid narratives. Every time someone gets shot by the cops or something and it goes viral, then oh yeah, look at what we go through, look at and stuff. Your emotions is how they control you. Your emotions is how they control you. We know there's piece of craps everywhere, but I feel like we got to sit back and turn off the TV sometimes and really just walk around and pay attention and see what's really going on, man. But it's a lot of screwed up stuff going on in the world for sure. It's a lot of screwed up people. But there also, as far as in America, has been a lot of narratives that have been pushed in in order to brainwash people. But with that being said, guys, original link will be in the description. And let me know what you guys think in the comments. I will see you all soon. Enjoy your day today. Much love.